this is for me a bit kind of strange thing to do, because I don't usually work with anything kind of related to Agamben or these things lately. Usually when you, for example, hear me speaking, I talk about Eurozone crisis and things more related to economy and these things. But I will just try to somehow present this book and make some points from there. Just to make a comment to Jussi, of course, one point that came to my mind about this, what are these forms of politics of how you kind of deactivate these old forms of politics. One, of course, Agamben's, one of his masters was Guy Debord, and Guy Debord's solution was moving to the countryside and drink 5 liters of wine every day and make yourself inoperative. Because Debord, he writes in his autobiography that I have been writing much less than most people who write, and I think this was this kind of inoperativity point, but I have been drinking more than most people who drink, so...
So the alcohol
But of course, and these kind of ideas come to mind about this, how we have to inactivate or make inoperative this kind of. But okay, I will try to present the book, but I will maybe first as some kind of new title or question to which I probably don't ever manage to get is this question that does the power have seek, or what annoys me in Agamben is that he always asking that what is the secret of power, or what is this arcanum imperii, but my question is, does the power have secrets? And I think no. I think everything usually is always said very clearly if you go to look from the right place, but I will try to get under this point. But okay, this kind of uso dei corpis, as Agamben said and as Jussi said, it's the last part of Homo Sacer series, and there he tries to develop more explicitly and to some extent a bit more widely some of his central concepts, such as this trying to inactivate or make inoperative this kind of ontology of dynamis and energeia, or potentiality and actuality, and the idea and all these things. But of course, just to make one point to Federico, and what Agamben actually very much emphasizes in the introduction to this book is that his idea is to kind of investigate the secret of power in the sphere of everyday life, or in the hidden abode of everyday life or something. And he kind of, I don't know if this is a shift or if it is something that he thinks he has been always doing, is that he's not researching big events or only the sovereignty, because I think more Alain Badiou is this philosopher of mega events and kind of Timo Soini of philosophy, who wants us to kind of leave all these minor things like feminism and these kind of stupid everyday things and go back to the real big events. But okay, you all know, and I quarrel every time with Janne about this because I hate Badiou. But anyway, but Agamben kind of he tries to find the secret of power somewhere, like in the kind of micro-politics of everyday life, or biopolitics. And already in the end of Regno e la Gloria, he writes that what our research has a matter of fact demonstrated is that the real problem, the central arcanum, okay, the secret of politics once again, is not sovereignty but governance or government, not God but the angel, not the king but the minister, not Sauli Niinistö but Stubb and Juha Sipilä, not the law but the police, or the governmental machine that they form and maintain in movement. So this is what Agamben says he is doing and trying to move into. I also think that he doesn't very well succeed in this thing. And in the end, even he doesn't manage to do it. He's still his kind of concepts and his conception of history kind of is still on a very macroscopic level, and he kind of. But I will try to somehow develop this point more. Because on the other hand, he says yes, we have to find the secret from the politics in kind of some petty events of everyday life, but on the other hand we always see something very grandiose, the history of Western philosophy, and we have to renovate, create new ontology and and go to Aristotle and kind of inactivate the Aristotelian ontology and read through all the classics of philosophy and this kind of. But of course Agamben thinks that the concepts of Western metaphysics and this metaphysics of operativity or of kind of energeia, actualization, energetic metaphysics is something that is in our everyday life, and to transform the everyday life we have to kind of deconstruct these metaphysical concepts. And I don't know, I have to say I find this, although people often think that Agamben is somehow Foucauldian or continuing the work of Foucault, I find this very different from Foucault's methodology. I will later try to develop this point. It more kind of reminds something of this kind of philosophical Marxism, which of course was dear to Guy Debord, like Georg Lukács and these things, who were thinking that if we want to transform the everyday life of the workers, we have to go through the Western metaphysics and read Hegel, and then there is some kind of similar idea that we have to find the politics from there, because of course for Agamben he clearly says that for him ontology and politics are inseparable, they cannot be separated, and also that ontology is always about anthropogenesis, it's about the problem of human, and which is also of course then a problem about the relationship or between nature and history, and because human is an animal, for whom historicity is a part of his nature or something like that. And then he kind of, when he kind of tries to inactivate this problem that what is human being or who is human, because this is kind of this police question, or question from the power is always to ask what are you and how are you. We have to try kind of inactivate this and create new ontology, which he calls modal ontology. I will explain also. But then there are this central concept, which is this inoperativity, or what is this related, is of course related to this anthropological or anthropogenetic question, because in his he thinks of the question that human being is without foundation or without some kind of natural environment of a kind of natural thing what to do, and then kind of in Western philosophy we kind of or Western history we have kind of two resolutions to this problem of human being kind of without foundation. The one is of course violence, in his old book which comes before Homo Sacer about which is called Linguaggio e la Morte, language and death. He says he somehow formulates this problem of Homo Sacer, that he says something that because human animal is without foundation, then this some kind of creation of philosophical foundation is a response to this, and it creates violence. He says something like the foundation. How is it going? Foundation of violence is a response to the violence of foundation, and something like this. And then it comes from there, and then the other option, of course, is that we define some kind of task to human animals, which is this question in Aristotelian philosophy. We have a long discussion about what is the ergon, or in Latin opus of human, and of course Aristotelians like Aristoteles and Dante always respond that there is this proprium opus of human being and its use of reason. So we kind of, when we define human is something that uses reason, it is the animal who has reason, and so on. But then of course this creates a kind of political hierarchy and kind of leads to this what Jussi was talking about, this old conception of kind of politics, because of course for Aristotle the point is always that this kind of, if the ergon or the task or operation or function that is proper to human beings to use reason, then it also creates a kind of hierarchy, because as Aristoteles, this is one of the points that Agamben develops in his book is that because Aristotle kind of in the first book of Politics he finds the legitimation or the foundation for political hierarchy, political rule or hierarchy from the kind of structure of human the relationship between mind and body or reason and other parts of the soul in human being, because Aristotle writes in the first book of Politics is but to resume it is in a living creature, as we say, that it is first possible to discern the rule both of the master and of statesman. The soul rules the body with the sway of a master, the intelligence, the appetites with constitutional or royal rule. So here we kind of find it is just in the same way as mind rules the body, is that the master has to rule his slaves in the Greek family, Greek oikos. And in the same way that the king or statesman rules the citizens, is that how reason must rule the other parts of the soul. And this is kind of for the idea is then when we have the idea that the task of human being is to use reason, then we will kind of end up to some hierarchy, because as Aristotle says after this is then in these examples it is manifest that it is natural and expedient for the body to be governed by the soul, and for the emotional part to be governed by the intellect, the part possessing reason. So the point is that if human animal is an animal who has reason, then it's actually not the whole animal that has reason, but there is also a part that has this reason. There is to morion logon ekon. And then Aristotle ends up kind of in these things that women and children and of course barbarians don't have this part. And kind of from
well, woman has the part that it's,
yeah, but it's
as
out
old,
of,
and it's only
Aristotle's
it's nothing different, but it's curious.
It's not working. It's out of order.
No, it doesn't have an authority. No, it's working.
It's working. It has an authority. But the point is anyway that and then Agamben kind of thinks that to deconstruct this hierarchy, we kind of also have to kind of go back to this whole concept of ergon and that human animal has, and then we have to kind of deconstruct or inactivate the whole ontology of the substance, and then this potentiality and actuality, dynamis and energeia, to get kind of rid of this ontologically based hierarchy. And of course, I personally think that actually these kind of Aristotle's racist and or kind of misogynic ideas should be examined quite carefully, because there it is actually not because of some kind of historical or liberal attack, but it's in those parts actually when Aristotle makes these statements, it is there that he also kind of ends up in problems with his concepts of poiesis and praxis, and they kind of don't work anymore. They kind of start to be kind of completely fucked up, because he doesn't know anymore what is poiesis and what is praxis, because kind of what slaves are, of course, they are some kind of instruments. The master must use the body of the slave, but then it's kind of, because they cannot be kind of just instruments for production, because the Greeks are not interested in production of value in the capitalist way, but of some kind of good life. Then what slaves do, it cannot be about fabrication. It must be about practice and all this. It's kind of, but I don't talk about this no more. I will try to go more into Agamben's points, but the idea is to kind of that we have to deconstruct this ontology to kind of and think of what is human being, what is human animal beyond any ergon or opus or operation. Dante speaks about operatio, that is property human, and it means kind of to somehow to profanate these anthropological concepts, because there is also a kind of I'm not sure if in this book Agamben refers to this, but I think both the Greek word ergon and Latin word opus have a kind of connotation to action of slaves or temple. They are service of God.
Ehdoton is agricultural work.
Yeah, but they have this kind of, it's somehow related to that it's a form of the service of God.
Labor has.
Yeah, labor has, but I think also opus or opera has some kind of connotation.
Labor has, opus opera has also a connection because it was temple slave was called.
Yeah, it's temple slaves, but anyway the idea is that if we define human animal through these concepts, they are kind of theological concepts and so on. And kind of we have to somehow create other kind of ontology, and this is Agamben's political project, and then we of course kind of end up through that we have to go through to kind of find this new politics which requires new ontologies, that we have to go through all the history of Western philosophy, and this of course is the idea that annoys me, that we have to first read all the books and before we can do anything, or otherwise we are violent. And this is kind of course in philosophy Hegelian is used as a kind of, it is kind of the Nazi card of philosophy nowadays, but I think Agamben is Hegelian in this sense that he kind of thinks that his history of philosophy is the heart or nucleus of world history, and the essential history, the history of the subject and so on. It's philosophy of history of philosophy, and we have to go through all these things. And there we will find the secret between in the concept of kind of secret that is hidden in this machine of separation of joy and bios and all these things. But then Agamben's point is that kind of we have to find from some minor text in the history of philosophy a kind of other kind of ontology which is not this kind of ontology of work or opera and this kind of, which Agamben has already before in his book Opus Dei, on which Jussi was also talking about. He has been kind of analyzing and criticizing this ontology of operativity and opus, which comes kind of from, and he says there that ecclesiastic liturgy is kind of very fundamental to the Western conception of metaphysics or ontology, and that in the kind of church debates how the role of the priest has been defined there. It has been very central to this development of this operative ontology. And his point is that when the church has tried to separate something they called opus operatum and opus operans, which means the work of God in the act of sacrament and the personal characteristics of the priest. They are kind of entirely separated, and this is important because we of course know that in the church there have been always these scandals that priests are pedophiles, or the famous story in Boccaccio's Decamerone where this priest tries to insert the tail into the peasant's wife and when he performs this act of sacrament. The point how the church resolved this was that we kind of separate these two things that because the sacrament takes place ex opere operato, that the priest is he's only at work there. It's just his job, so it doesn't matter what his personal characteristics are, because it's the act of God that goes through him, and his personal characteristics don't matter to the kind of how it succeeds this sacrament, and there is this kind of, in this ontology of operativity, it is kind of an ontology of only being at work, or this is just my job, and this kind of idea. But then of course, and this is something kind of Agamben analyzes also to an extent in this relationship between master and slave, and how he thinks that because where this title of the book, Use of the Bodies, it comes of course also from Aristotle's Politics, this expression creasis tu somatur, or is it in plural? I don't remember. It on somatur. Anyway, it refers to this idea that the master is only using the body of the slave, and it's actually kind of part of of the master's own body. Michel Foucault, in some of his new lectures, I don't remember exactly in which, he analyzes this Greek literature on sexual relations between master and slave, and in this kind of the Greek thinks it's kind of natural that the master goes to rape the slaves because they are part of his own body, and just like hand, it is kind of to use your own hand and use your slave. It's kind of something comparable, but Agamben's point is that it is only when this kind of traditional use of the other's body comes captured inside the system of right or law. Or I would like to translate this dirit also as justice, but of course it is my idiosyncrasy that Agamben wants us to get rid of completely. It's only in here kind of that it ends up with some very violent points. So the problem is always the law and the capture of this use of the bodies into law, but Agamben thinks that also in this Aristotelian discussion on the use of the body of the slave, we can kind of find some kind of key to this new non-energetic or not actualization ontology, and for this new theory of use that can liberate us from the structure of law or right, or what Jussi was describing, and his point, he then goes very widely to analyze this concept of kresis or of use in Greek philosophy, which he points out that in topics Aristotle first used a kind of dual opposition, not between dynamis and energeia as then lately in his major works, but there was a separation between dynamis, the potentiality, and then use, kresis, and Agamben thinks kind of course here he also kind of tries to radicalize Aristotle, find from Aristotle this kind of from an older concept of Aristotle and use it kind of against the bad kind of degenerated concept of Aristotle, which is then energeia and energy, energizing. And that he thinks that in this kind of older term that Aristotle used, which is kresis, we can find some kind of key to this new ontology and new politics, which is an idea of use without right or without possession and property, and where he also then, just to point out, he also kind of criticizes this in relationship to this new idea of commons, which often is considered as some kind of new form of property, that we have private property and we have public, and then common is the third option, but it's kind of new form. Commons is a new form of property. Agamben kind of criticizes this idea from this point of view that right is always violent, and that it has a kind of archaeology or history that is always related to the property of another's body and to slavery and some kind of this kind of, I don't know if Agamben would maybe think that if we conceive commons as new form of property, then we end up on this kind of things that you must let me borrow your underwear or otherwise you are evil, or this kind of, I don't know. If this is kind of, if we conceive commons as property, then we kind of this kind of come to this hippie ideas. You must sleep with me or otherwise share your body with me, or then you are evil. So we have to think of commons in some other way or something. I don't know if this is Agamben's idea. But it sounds like this because he, at the same point when he criticizes this idea of commons as property, he refers to this idea that he thinks the genealogy of the right or law is related to the ownership of slaves. Ownership of slaves. But anyway, but then he kind of goes to point out that from this old idea of kresis we can find this new ontology, because as he says, and of course goes to analyze some master's thesis of Emile Benveniste's pupil, which he has found somewhere, which is about the use of the Greek word krestsai. And he kind of course makes a very long discussion with this master's thesis and criticizes its points which Agamben thinks of course are false, and he has understood better this philological point, which is that he emphasizes the point that the Greek verb to use krestsai is a medial verb, is it in Finland called voice, this pal, or it's medial voice, which means that there is not a separation of subject and object, but that this use refers to something where the subject kind of takes place at the same, in this kind of, in the same process. Where there is the subject is not above the action, but it is the place of its taking place, it's happening. It is once again, of course, zone of indetermination between subject and object. But then, what kind of for me seems to be this Agamben's political point, or what is his point in this, is that somehow he kind of sees that now we are coming to some kind of era where this relationship between master and slave in Greek society or Aristotelian philosophy is somehow kind of inside of our own heads or something. We are now becoming the despots of ourselves, and this relationship now is kind of inside of our head, and that what we have to think with this new theory of use is that we have to kind of to think of the use of ourselves, not in the same way we kind of rule ourselves in a way that there is a subject and that we make ourselves an object that can be ruled, and that you must develop yourself and so on, and that we should have kind of learn how to use ourselves, use our own potentialities freely, and not control ourselves and try to develop ourselves in this sense. And Agamben, of course, also he goes then to analyze Heidegger's some points, and there he kind of seems to start to develop this idea that what is ontology of operativity and ontology of actualization of the potentiality. Aristotelian ontology of because in the Aristotelian idea of dynamism and energy, the point is of course also that the potentiality has to be actualized, and the actuality is more real, and what this means now is some kind of ontology of, or what made Western ontologies about this, some kind of ontology of or this ontology of operativity means some kind of ontology of self-fulfillment, or what is called. We must always fulfill ourselves, or come as you are. It is a kind of it becomes a duty, he says in Opus Dei. He analyzes Kant and says that this ontology of actualization is also an ontology of duty or obligation, and there is kind of this. It has kind of become an obligation to fulfill ourselves and come as you are, and so on. But then of course Agamben writes that it's actually the duty or the kind of, because this Aristotelian ontology ends up always in some in different paradoxes, that this actually it is kind of impossible, and the point is actually that it's not come as you are, but rather come something that you can never be, or it's some kind of impossible model that we should have to be following. We have to fulfill ourselves according to some model that is impossible. Okay, this is, to some extent I think it's a valid point. It's a good point, but then the problem is of course that how Agamben starts to analyze this and kind of analyze this history what the subject has, is that his conception of history is for me very strange. And here we kind of come of course to the same question also to some extent about which Federico was talking about, because for Agamben the kind of, because let's say for Foucault, when Foucault talks about that the subject has a history and that all these ideas of that you must control yourself and be an entrepreneur or despot of yourself, they come from a certain history of technologies or techniques, concrete techniques of governing and technologies of yourself, and not kind of, for Agamben it's on the other hand, it's the history is this kind of history of Western ontology and metaphysics, and it is there that he tries to then go and find the secret of power. It of course comes very clear because also in Uso dei Corpi, Agamben develops further a theme that he has already been developing in the old atheist book Linguaggio e la Morte, which is the analysis of kind of basis of Western ontology in the Aristotelian conception of substance. Substance and that of course there is this famous Aristotelian conception of the first substance as kind of hypokemenon, which is famous in Heidegger. But then there is this also another definition, Aristotelian definition of, which is of course also very kind of well known from Heideggerian analysis of Aristotle, is this definition of being as what is it? That to enti einoi, and Agamben analyzes that this en there means was, and it refers to imperfect, and there time is introduced into being, and which of course is familiar from Heidegger, but it kind of for Agamben it means that if we analyze being and if we analyze ontology, we have to go to time and to past and to history, and history is central. And he kind of, what is very clear is that his conception of history is kind of, even in the end, it's very Heideggerian. It comes from when he develops the same theme in the last seminar, or some kind of epilogue of Linguaggio e la Morte, where he actually analyzes Heidegger's conception of history. History as some kind of absolution or ereignis. And it's also, there seems to be that the same idea is always present in Agamben, that history is some kind of history of absolution or some kind of revelation history, or it has some kind of theological nature, and in this point, kind of in comparison to Foucault, it's kind of not completely profanated history, but it's some kind of history of absolution. And then we expect the kind of absolution or liberation to come when the history goes until the end, and we have read all the books and kind of become conscious of all this history of ontology, and only then after, when everything first has gone completely fucked up, and then when we have read all these books of Western ontology and realized what is the secret in there, and then we can kind of absolve ourselves from the secret of power. But kind of this of course then comes to the central question if for Agamben ontology means, and kind of question about man, or anthropogenesis, or the relationship of nature and history in man. In man, he says that we have to kind of try to understand culture and nature, or history of nature as inseparable, or this. But I kind of have this feeling that he still always kind of collapses on the side of history, or this kind of some kind of Geisteswissenschaften conception of history, which is some kind of history of universal spirit, and which is kind of materialized in classics of philosophy and so on. And I think the point is that we would have to kind of to find some kind of real way to critique Agamben on the kind of fundamental level, is to think of this relationship between nature and history in another way, because I actually, what I would say, or what my conception is, that history or historicity, or the capacity to make history, so-called, is a biological characteristic of human species, in the same way as walking in an erect position. But to kind of understand this relationship between them, we would also have to go to the side of kind of think of the nature of human animal in another way. I personally have tried to kind of find this way of understanding it through neurology, or of human brain, which is kind of interface between nature and history, and which is a historical organ. But I will not be able to kind of develop this anymore. But then just to come to this, I don't know how much time I have. How much late are we from the schedule?
Do you have a lot of? You have still time. But
yeah, I have time. Yeah, I can.
But do you have something to end or some point?
Well, I have lots of points, but I can just because I had made a lot of notes of what to talk, but I have not been talking about that at all. But okay, maybe I can just then try to kind of to somehow formulate this what I kind of don't like in Agamben, or this way to formulate some kind of alternative is to come then to Foucault, of course, and what of course came to my mind, because very often people nowadays think of kind of Agamben and Foucault as together because both talk about biopolitics, but I think of course Federico has been talking about, and I have been mentioning this very different conception of, even when Agamben says that he wants to research the minister and not the king, then he always goes into the level of something very grandiose, and I think this conception of the secret of power, or the kind of arcanum imperii, is part of the problem, in the way that if kind of, I don't know, to somehow kind of think of Agamben's style of thinking, it reminds me, and maybe even to compare him with Foucault, it reminds me of this, because in the first chapter in Erich Auerbach's book on mimesis, this famous book he wrote in Istanbul during the Second World War, he compares the Greek and the Judeo-Christian style of narration, and he says kind of in the Greek style of narration, in Homeric epics, everything is always present, everything is clear, and it is present there is no kind of secrets, but then in the Judeo-Christian mode of narration there always has to be lacuna and some kind of obscure parts which then have to be transcended in order to get to the truth, and in this sense I would kind of, by the way, in this sense I think the kind of genealogy of Hegelian dialectics is not in Greek philosophy or Platonic dialectics, but it's rather in this Judeo-Christian idea of obscurity that you have to transcend and aufheben. So, and Agamben in this sense is a very kind of Judeo-Christian style of thinker, but there are always these kind of obscure parts that you have to transcend, and there are always, Auerbach says that in this Judeo-Christian style of narration there are always claims of universal history and universality and so on, but on the other hand in Greek mode of narration there are just kind of particularities, just as Foucault emphasizes his own methodology in his lectures, that he is nihilist and historicist, in the sense that there is no general theory of power, there are only particular dispositives of power and so on, and not this universal history. And what Foucault, just to kind of emphasize this difference between Foucault and Agamben, is what Foucault writes in his lectures Société Punitive, which were published 2 years ago. He kind of writes about his methodology, and well, of course it has been always very clear that Foucault was always kind of, he didn't like to comment on so-called great thinkers. He doesn't write so much. He always tries to find some kind of minor texts or writings that he comments. And in these lectures of 72-73 on this punitive society, he presents some kind of methodological idea for which this is based. And he says that these great thinkers, these texts that are always read and commented, and their interpretation is some stupid things that intellectuals are doing. These official discourses form some kind of canon that is created for schools, and we can just kind of talk about their interpretation without reading the kind of important discourses, well, the essential conflicts that are kind of essential to some era are materialized. Foucault says kind of interpretation is always vain, because everything is always said directly if you look from the right place. And it's only intellectuals who think that those who are in power are stupid, and Alexander Stubb is tweeting about golf even though there is a war in Ukraine and so on, and capitalists cannot see beyond their own narrow zone and so on. And Foucault thinks that never the bourgeois are never stupid, and it is not that they don't understand what they are doing, and we have to find this secret of power. He says that that Foucault writes that there is no depth of interpretation which would find something that others have not been able to say. As a matter of fact, others have always already said everything. And the problem is not to find from the lacuna of the text these traces from what is not said and that what has remained unsaid. And it means that the cynicism or intelligence of the bourgeoisie should never be searched from the texts or of works of some author. If the bourgeoisie seems to be stupid, it is only because we try to look for the stupidity of intelligence from these kind of school text, canonical school text. And the point is then kind of that I find this Agamben's methodology of trying to find the secret of power very problematic. I think the point is to kind of that we have to try to look from the right place, and where everything is said, not from this kind of great works and school texts, but because you can always, if you want to understand, politics of Finnish government or something, or what is taking place there, you don't have to go and read the program or the declaration of the government. You can find the points when you find the kind of less visible and less scholar canonic points. You have to go and read some minor memorandums of Elinkeinoelämän keskusliitto and so on. Everything is always said there. The point, for example, in austerity is not to create more economic growth, but it is to cut the social services in order to make the capitalists. It is to enlarge the power of capitalists and to cut the governmental services that can give more negotiating power to workers. It is. If you go and look from the right place, it is said there. You don't need to interpret. This is kind of my methodological point against Agamben.
Okay, thanks.